I
Welcome
hate
back,
you
everyone.
about getting like a
You motherfucker.
sorry.
What'd you say?
Sorry, dude.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Front Row Cinema, a movie podcast for movie lovers by movie lovers. I am your host, as always, TJ Trimboli, and with me is my co-host, acclaimed scholar, came to us all the way from the Charles Xavier School for Gifted Children, Dr. James O'Reilly.
Hey, what's going on, buddy?
It's going, man. And each week we run down a movie from my 1,000 movies in theaters and we see how well it's aged, along with the hype surrounding the film, its box office analysis, and legacy in the film industry. And we've got a whopper of a movie tonight. Jim, what are we watching?
X-Men.
We're watching the 2000 superhero film X-Men, directed by Bryan Singer and starring Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart, and Ian McKellen. X-Men tells the story. It depicts a world where an unknown portion of people are mutants, possessing superhuman powers that make them distrusted by normal humans. It focuses on mutants Wolverine and Rogue as they are brought into a conflict between two groups with radically different approaches to bringing about the acceptance of mutant kind. Charles Xavier's X-Men, and the Brotherhood of Mutants led by Magneto. That's not a bad log line right there compared to some of the other ones that we've come across.
Yeah, I mean it's straightforward. It's a bit of a mouthful, but yeah, it makes sense.
It is a bit of a mouthful. Whenever you have to do a lot of setup before you can get to what the actual log line is, never a good sign there. That's so the more sentences you need, the tougher that log line starts to become.
Yeah, but I mean it did capture the movie pretty well. So
It did. Once
that
once
works.
once we get into the central conflict. I love the just the radically different approaches from Charles Xavier's X-Men and the Brotherhood of Mutants.
Yeah, I mean they are kind of radically different, I suppose, in ideology. I about halfway through the movie, I couldn't help but think that Charles Xavier is just using a front school to create a paramilitary organization, but
We're not so different,
he
you and
he
I.
was sort of doing exactly what everyone was afraid of.
Yeah, like he even says when he's like showing Wolverine around, he's just like under the ground, it's a whole different story. And
Yeah,
then show
that's
off,
exactly the part I'm talking about, where I was like, yeah, why are you doing that?
Jean
That's
Grey's got like a crazy laboratory, like they got sweet rides, like
yeah,
he's got a whole room where he can just like telekinetically connect to any person on the planet.
yeah. Anybody in the world, they've got that jet where they're like, man, if you can find this thing, you're doing great. Like, and they have every reason to be afraid of these people.
But this was a fun one to go back to and watch. This is one of the first movies I think that we've come across that I hadn't watched since I had seen it in theaters. Like this is probably the first time I've watched it. It came out in 2000, so almost 23 years. So it was interesting to go back and see like a completely different era of superhero movies on screen compared to what you see today.
Yeah, and I mean, right, there wasn't. This is like the before times when there wasn't very many superhero movies at all.
Like before this movie, it was what just really Tim Burton's Batman.
Yeah, I mean
Like
that's
the
probably
Batman
I mean the
franchise.
Superman movies with Christopher Reeve were a thing.
Oh yeah,
Um,
those were. I always forget those because spoiler alert, hot take, I hate all of those. I don't even like the
really?
first. Yeah, I don't even like the first two. I don't know. I
The
don't know
second
what it
one's really
is.
good.
I don't know. I just of all this, I'm famous, as you know, for not enjoying superhero movies. And I think Superman is at like the top of that list because he's just the most boring character I've ever come across.
Yeah, I mean that's I definitely can understand where you're coming from. He's sort of invulnerable, which always makes things a little bit boring. But yeah, I mean like there was superhero movies existed before X-Men, but they weren't anywhere near what they are today, right? Which is like I don't know how many of them come out a year now between
Oh,
everybody who's making superhero movies.
it's almost too hard to count the amount that come out these days. It's definitely slowed down post COVID, but it's still a lot. Like you had what I think four from DC this year and three from Marvel. That's already a lot.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean like I guess the way I would put it is that I don't even know that I would call it its own genre back when X-Men came out. It definitely is now, but back then X-Men was more an action movie than anything else. That it just happened to be based on like a thing I had heard of, and like interacted with before.
Absolutely. Yeah, because it was such new ground that they were breaking, especially in X-Men. You feel it because it feels so like I don't want to say slow because it's not that, but you see like how frenetic the superhero movies are today, and watching this original X-Men is like watching like a slow drama compared to like how crazy they are today.
Yeah, I had that exact thought while I was watching this movie, which was like, and I guess that's kind of why I would say that it's more of a genre now because it's a lot more predictable, like what beats you're gonna hit in those movies and when you're gonna hit them. Um, and yeah, I mean, like I don't know that I would call X-Men a slow movie, but it's noticeably slower than your average Marvel affair these days, right? Like I don't know that I know they're like making an X-Men movie. I would imagine it's not going to be anything like the one that I just watched, you know?
Yeah. Especially even later X-Men movies. Like if you were to watch that X-Men movie and then go and watch the last one they made, X-Men Dark Phoenix, you would be like, this is the same universe.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so right, and that Dark Phoenix is what, like 2016, 2017, so that's definitely more a part of the like modern superhero zeitgeist for sure.
Didn't Dark Phoenix come out right before COVID? Wasn't it like 2019?
I have no idea. You probably know better than I do, honestly. I was just guessing.
I think Dark Phoenix was like right before COVID. I could be wrong, but I think it was later like that. But I
Yeah,
mean,
so
you
like
look, but you look at any of the X-Men movies that came out in the 2010s, and they were much more of what you expect of a superhero movie today compared to this. Like it doesn't even feel like the same franchise. You compare
yeah, like
those two movies.
even Days of Future Past, right, is so different than this first movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think not to jump too far ahead, but I think that's to this movie's credit, like the original X-Men's credit. I definitely liked the first like half hour, 45 minutes of this movie a lot.
Was this a movie? Did you see this one in theaters? Do you remember? Do you have any memories of seeing this movie as a kid when it came out?
I remember, I'm pretty sure I saw this in theaters with my dad. I couldn't tell you much more than that.
I know I also, this was another classic that Big Rob took me to. And it's been interesting looking at these as we've done them week over week because this is the first time that I've noticed as we've been going through these episodes that I was seeing movies consistently. Because, 2 weeks ago we did Perfect Storm that came out, and then a week later, after Perfect Storm, Scary Movie came out, and I went and saw that last week's episode, and then now this week's episode X-Men came out the week after Scary Movie. So that's 3 weeks in a row.
Oh, yeah,
And
so we're starting to get into like a rhythm here.
yeah, we're getting some consistency here. Big Rob was like every Friday, let's go, baby. Get in the car. We're going to catch the movie.
Yeah. That's interesting. If we really start doing it every week, which I think at some point will happen, you might be able to get into some more context about like stuff that was going on and other things like that.
Yeah, and seeing how quickly like these movies dropped out of like the box office once we start getting, and I think we'll get there once we start getting to when, you and me and all the guys used to go to the movies every week. We'll start getting into a lot of that stuff. But it was interesting to see it now looking at this. And I was like, oh, hey, look, hey, in the summer of 2000, Big Rob he was wheeling and dealing.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was an interesting one to see. That also came up also as I was looking for that, as far as box office tally, because not only was that like the first 3 weekends that I noticed that my dad took me to the movies in a row, but a note that I saw that I learned that was pretty interesting is those three movies that we just talked about, The Perfect Storm, Scary Movie, and then now X-Men,
Right.
was the first time in history that the box office had 3 consecutive weekends where the new movie grossed over $40 million.
The first time ever, you're saying?
Yeah,
Huh.
where three movies
Interesting.
consecutively week over week, three new movies being released, all made over $40 million. First time in history, which is such
Yeah,
a
so
thing that you wouldn't think to happen that late because you see it so prevalently now. But then at the same time, you look at it and you're like, no, like the 90s movies, like while you got like movies that would come out and do big numbers, like it wasn't week over week.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that the stat that you just threw at me makes it seem like we're kind of in the middle of when the box office is really turning into like a boom. You know what I mean?
We're really in that heyday where it's really starting to turn into what we would look at it as today, where you're starting to get those juggernaut of movies that would come out or more consistency of movie goers going to cinema.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I just know, like, it's 2000 is the year we're up to now, and I know from being alive at this time that Spider-Man is waiting in the wings, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's really the first movie that I can remember that was like a huge box office, like, it was like news. Like, you woke up on Monday and before school, it was like, Spider-Man made $100+ million, and it was like a big deal, you know?
Yeah. Like we're definitely in that season now where you're starting to see this box office shape itself. And it's a fun thing to look back on because when we were kids, like I never thought about any of that or anything. You were just like, because
Well,
that
yeah,
was the
of
thing I
course.
always used to talk about when we were in high school was shitting so much on the movies that were coming out that we were going to see week over week because, I grew up watching, Turner Classic Movies with my grandma. So I watched so many movies from the 40s and 50s, and I loved that style of filmmaking and those old style movies. So when we were in high school and we were seeing these movies that were coming out, I consistently just shit on so many of them. But now, like, I look back on it and realize just how many good movies that we were getting and how just of a juggernaut that, you know, 10 plus years of movies that we were seeing in the mid 2000s were to cinema. Like you don't realize it when you're living through it, but looking back on it now, it was like it was so much more important than we realized.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, I think, to keep going through because I'm definitely want to look back on a time that in my head is a much better time for movies and see if I still think that. You know what I mean? And if
Absolutely.
there's like if there's any survivorship bias where most of the time I'm just watching the ones that I really liked. So it's interesting to go back and look at the ones that I was just seeing every week. You know what I mean? Like that I maybe don't necessarily remember. So no, I get what you're talking about. It's going to be a cool thing to dive into. I agree.
To the ones that like slip through the cracks that like we don't return to like year after year.
Yeah, like a year from now, we could be talking over Zoom and saying, "Man, the 2000s weren't nearly as good as I remember." It's definitely possible. I don't think that's what's going to happen, but
Entirely possible. No, I don't think that will happen either. I think there was so many more gems in there than we realized as kids going to the movies. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun when we, continue to get deeper into the mid 2000s and see all these movies that we went and saw when we were in high school and realized that we saw some really good fucking movies. But anyway, we're talking about X-Men. Jim, let me hear some other box office stats. That was the big one that I saw. What ones did you see in there that dropped in for X-Men?
okay, so it opened July 14th, 2000, with $57.5 million in the opening weekend. This is a pretty interesting one because we're starting to add a lot of qualifiers here. Highest opening for a superhero film non-sequel released in July.
Very specific.
So yeah, right. We're really honing in on like I don't know how many of those do you think there was at the time? Like a couple. Like
All right. There was probably like what the two Batman movies that came out over the summer, like that.
yeah, well, and that's assuming they came out in July. Who the heck really knows, you know? But yeah, so I mean, but still, like you said, that 57.5 million goes to that 3 weeks in a row where people were having big opening weekends. And at the time, this was the sixth biggest opening ever.
Which is still crazy to think about.
Yeah, like it really is like it feels like we're just at the beginning of the box office becoming like huge business, because these numbers aren't really that impressive to me, like just like at first glance. And then it seems like every time we talk about one that makes a lot of money opening weekend, it's in the top 10 ever. You know what I mean?
Because like you would look at that at face value and be like, all right, 57.5. Like that's you look at it in today, you're like, that's a modest opening weekend. And then you see it and you're like, oh no, when that came out, it was the sixth biggest ever to happen. And you're like,
Yeah,
oh
for like a
shit.
big ensemble superhero movie, 57.5 million would be like a huge failure these days.
If the latest X-Men movie opened up to 57.5 million, be a way different story today.
Yeah, and I mean, so like this is obviously 20 years ago, but even like in like 2010 and 2015, I feel like 100 million became a pretty regular occurrence there for a while. That was like less and less impressive, and so yeah, it's just interesting to see we're kind of at like the cusp of when that's gonna start taking off. It looks like. It's also the second largest opening weekend of the year behind Mission Impossible 2. So right, like this is like big business in the year 2000 and behind Mission Impossible 2, which how dare you not have seen that movie? Very
I kick
disappointed we don't
myself.
get to talk
Well,
about
dude,
that.
like I told you, I came way too late to the John Woo party, and I kick myself every day for it.
We might have another candidate for flicks you missed.
Oh, dude, that would be a good flick you missed, man. Mission Impossible 2, absolute classic.
Yeah, so we'll get into what that is another time, but so it finished its run with 157.3 million domestic, 139 million international, just a shade under 300 million total with 296.3.
For trying to kick off a franchise and putting out such a big question mark of a movie, that's really solid.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're ever questioning if a movie was a success, if they made two sequels, it was. They were very happy with what happened.
If you got a trilogy back in those days, like you did good business. Like you were doing good. That's crazy. Yeah, those are good numbers, especially for such a because that was probably such a gamble to make that movie back then. Because like you said, like Spider-Man is really the impetus that really takes off the superhero franchise. Like this was like the appetizer. So for this movie to do as well as it did and have the gumption to put out this movie before you had something like Spider-Man that blew up and showed that these kind of franchise like Spider-Man's the golden boy. And before the golden boy came out, they were like, let's try the X-Men.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of big names in this movie that I imagine called some pretty high salaries, like demanded some pretty high salaries to pay out.
Were
I
they
mean, you're
though back
talking about.
then?
I mean, Patrick Stewart was right. Ian McKellen was. I
Yeah.
know that they were popular, like they were famous for
Oh no, I'm
sure.
sure those two were because obviously yeah, Patrick Stewart's coming off of Star Trek. Ian McKellen is well, he hadn't made Lord of the Rings yet.
Yeah, that's true.
So what was he really known for before? Because as a kid, the first thing I can remember seeing him in is this. Like he was a big like Broadway actor,
Gotcha. Okay, so
and
maybe
like
he
a
wasn't
West
as
End
big a
actor.
deal
Yeah, so
as
he
I
couldn't have
thought.
cost that much. I think Patrick Stewart was probably the most expensive guy, but even still, like how much could
Yeah,
he
and like
possibly have cost?
that's fair. Like this Hugh Jackman was kind of like not really a thing when this movie
This was
came
his
out.
first
This is
movie,
kind of
I
what
think.
makes him a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Anna Paquin was she was a child actress and what like Fly Away Home like
I guess, yeah. All right, so fair enough. Yeah, it's a lot of people who are gonna become famous.
but still that's a gamble. That's such a gamble to be like let's
I
make
mean that
this
probably makes it
ensemble
more of a
movie.
gamble, right? If there's
Yeah.
if there's like a huge ensemble of people that aren't really that popular or famous.
Yeah. And yeah, so that's a huge gamble and that they were probably kissing the ground with that worldwide total right there. One of the my last little bit of research that I was looking in and it made me chuckle before we really dive into the meat and potatoes of
Yeah.
this movie is take a guess at where you think they premiered the movie.
Um, I don't know. I don't know. Somewhere in New York City.
That well, yes, in New York City, but these motherfuckers decided to hold the premiere for this movie on Ellis Island.
Oh, okay, because that's where it ends. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but that's like that's one of those things that like I looked at it and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, and then you move on. But then I'm sitting there thinking of it. I was like, dude, I would be so pissed if
Is
I had
there
to
is
get
there a
all.
movie theater on Ellis Island?
No, there's not. So like that, I would be so pissed if they were like, "Yeah, we want you to get all dressed up, and then we're gonna throw you on a boat. We're gonna take you down to Ellis Island. You're gonna watch it on this weird looking screen, on right along the side of Ellis Island." It's probably like there's no way they got a good screen or a good sound system. They were probably watching it like outside on like a projector.
Yeah, like that's yeah, that doesn't sound like the way I would want to watch a movie.
Yeah,
It
I'd
seems
be
like
like,
a cool stunt, I suppose. I'm sure that got
exactly.
some
Yeah, it was
attention.
one of those things that like you could tell it was just like a big star. So, but like the second they were like, "Yeah, everyone's gonna get on a boat. We're gonna go to Ellis Island." I'd be like, "Yeah, I'm not coming to that."
Do you think they like sprung it on people, or like I feel like they knew they were going, right?
Well, yeah, you probably knew in advance, but like if I was like one of the actors in that movie and like my agent was like, "Oh yeah, they're gonna hold the premiere at Ellis Island," I'd be like, "I'm not going to that. Get me out of that."
Oh yeah, yeah.
I'd be like, "Fuck that noise." Let's dive into the goodies. Let me hear from you, Jim. What worked for you in this movie?
I mean, I suppose the ensemble part of it kind of worked and also didn't work for me.
I can
I
agree with that. I think it was a pro and a detriment to it at the same time.
yeah, I thought the movie was strongest early on when it was just really kind of Wolverine and Rogue traveling together and like meeting each other and all that. Um so I liked and I did like the opening with like the concentration camp and Magneto's kind of like very brief origin story and then like the setup for what he was start trying to do. Um so yeah, I liked it when it was like smaller, when there was like a clear villain and there was two people that I was following. And then once it got bigger, like I kind of enjoyed like how they interwove the powers into a lot of the first like 45 minutes to an hour. Like really like every scene was being driven by them in some way. Like it felt like they got like the most out of it, and part of that was because they had so many different places they could go to draw on. So I liked that, but it also like the middle of the movie felt like very directionless to me, you know. It was hard for me to really sink my teeth into like who was important, and I mean like Rogue obviously was, but yeah, I don't know, I just felt like it meandered through the middle of the movie just because there was so many people I was trying to keep track of and trying to be interested in, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Because I think this movie suffers from the same problem that the Phantom Menace does that we were talking about, is that there's no clear protagonist. Like there's
Yeah,
no
that's
clear
fair.
main like we start with Magneto's origin story, and I am always a firm believer in the opening scene should establish our villain and how much of a force he can be before we meet our heroes. And but then from there, we're introduced to so many people that you never get a clear idea of who we're supposed to be latching onto and following here that's going to go through the big cathartic change. And clearly in this movie, it's Wolverine, but they want it to also be Rogue, but
Yeah,
they
see, I
can't
don't.
decide on who they firmly want it to be. So you're just constantly crisscrossing to the point that every time that you would settle in with one, it switches to the other one. And now you're playing catch up again, and it hurts the movie in that sense.
Yeah, I'm gonna get like probably like a little too nerdy and like nitpicky here.
Oh, get nerdy for me, girl.
I would say there's like a difference between your protagonist and your main character, right? Like, and to me, Wolverine is really the main character in this movie. He's tends to be at the center of what's happening at the plot. He's like the person you're watching in the big cool fights most of the time. Um, you follow him. I want to say he probably has the most screen time out of anybody in this movie, but that's just more on feel than anything else. Um, so I would say he's your main character, and then I would say Rogue is really like your protagonist, just because you see her first, you see like what her like core issue is, like where she can't like get close to people, like literally if she touches people, they die, you know? Um, and by the end of the movie, she's like, you know, she's like playing foosball with her friends, and she's like, you know, it's all gonna be okay. Like I think she's really the person who goes from like makes the biggest change over the course of the movie. So yeah, I mean, but I agree with you though that like there is like too much push and pull between those two, and like because Wolverine's the one with the most screen time, and because the change is happening mostly to Rogue, like the change with Rogue almost feels cheap, you know?
And I think that's something that they needed to work on, especially because like I got no problem with you wanting to do an ensemble and you wanting to have, your multiple, storylines that we're going to follow.
Yeah,
But the
and especially in an
problem,
X-Men movie, right? Like you kind
yeah,
of have to do an ensemble. That's like the whole point of it.
yeah, when you have so many of them, you're going to need to juggle a bunch of moving threads. My issue, mainly though, with this movie is that most of those threads all just feel like setup. Like Wolverine is the main character and he has the majority of screen time, but everything that we learn about him is all just set up for the next movie.
Yeah, that's fair. Right. It's all about because that's what happens in X2, right? He goes and uncovers everything.
Everything with Stryker, yeah. And like you get the bits of it in here where like Jean touches him or whatever, and they see like a bits and pieces, fragments, and they, learn that like, oh, the adamantium was made here or done here or whatever, and he sees the like flashes. And then at the end of the movie, he just gets the location of a base, and it's just like, really? Like,
Yeah, he's got some things to take care of up
yeah.
north.
Yeah. So like his whole entire journey in this movie just feels like setup. And that's the exact thing that we were rallying about with Phantom Menace too, is that the whole movie just feels like setup for later movies. And when you look back on it, like I'm sure like once we watch X2, it'll be like, oh, like that really like when you can watch the full trilogy, you're like, oh yeah, this all feels like part of one grand thing. But when you're taking these movies at face value for the one specific one you're watching, it cheapens it.
Yeah, and that always drives me crazy with trilogies back then. Like I feel like it's a thing all the time where the first movie is really good and like a standalone movie, and then once you start trying to make things into too much of a franchise and try and interconnect them too much and try and set up things for down the line, like yeah, like I always hate it when the standalone movies in a trilogy, I can't just watch them and enjoy them. So yeah, I definitely get what you're saying. Like his screen time is moving the plot along, but it's also like more focused on what's gonna happen in movie two and movie three, and even yeah, like even the relationship, like the weird love triangle that gets started in this movie between him, Cyclops, and Jean Grey. Like there's no real payoff to it. It's just kind of like this weird like seasoning in this movie, and then eventually it pays off like 7 years later in the third movie.
There's a lot of the threads in this are all just set up with and I think that's where the biggest misstep probably is in what they should have focused in on this movie, because I have no problem like if you want to like set up those threads, like obviously if you're going to create this franchise, like you need to sprinkle stuff that is kind of like a teaser for what you could expect, going forward when we open up this world more. But the best movies that tend to be able to do that are ones that hone in on a specific thread of an A story and then use those B stories and C stories to sprinkle those spreads. And the problem here is that they want to have their cake and eat it too, where they want Wolverine to be front and center, but they want his story to be sprinkled for later stories. So I think this movie would have been better focused if our main characters focused in on the thing that works the most for me, and that is the dichotomy between Xavier and Magneto.
Yeah, and I mean that right. That is kind of the thing that's driving this movie, right? Is
Yeah.
like these two old friends like on this collision course that is just like they both know they're on, you know?
And like they play it up like when they even show them at the end, like playing chess. Like I would think I would have enjoyed more if the main characters were the two of them and all of the other characters that we're seeing, like Wolverine and Jean Grey, now that those are just kind of like pawns on a chessboard to the two of them.
Yeah, kind of. No,
Sense.
I see what you're saying. And like again, that's definitely a thing I feel like more throughout all three movies. Like as they
Yeah.
go on, like that's a central thing. So like I mean this movie does do a lot of heavy lifting to set up a franchise, which is good, but it does like to your point, it does make the individual viewing of this movie less good. I think the movie that did it the best that I can think of off the top of my head is Batman Begins, where it has a villain that they like face off with and fight, and it's all about these two guys and like their relationship and the mentorship that they had, and like there's a satisfying end to that story, and then at the end of the movie they're just like, by the way, we found this card that says Joker on it, and it's like, okay, cool, there's going to be a sequel. That's literally all I needed. And figure everything else out later. Um,
Like it works when you hone in on a central premise and everything about the story focuses in on that premise.
yeah, and so I don't know. I mean, like, I guess like you could also say Wolverine changes by the end of this movie because does he seem like the kind of guy in the beginning who would like risk his own life to save like some random teenage girl? Like, probably not, you know?
He learns to
Um,
protect teenage girls.
so I don't know. I feel like maybe we're being a little nitpicky. I
Oh
definitely
no,
get the point of it, like of what we're saying, but I think though, like they actually do a pretty good job of balancing it. And like I don't know, it definitely takes away from this movie, and this I definitely like later movies in the franchise better for sure. Um, but I do think that they do a decent job overall of like balancing the two things. And you know, it's easy to complain about the setup when I watched X-Men. You know, I'm probably much happier that it's there when I watch X2. You know what I mean?
and no, I don't want it to come off thinking that like I didn't like this movie because I did enjoy this movie. And you know, those things that we're talking about are just, you know, things that you notice when watching them that don't actively hurt the movie, but it's just stuff that you realize to be like, oh, like it would have been more focused. But I still enjoyed the movie, and I do think this movie had a tall order in all of the things that it had to do in not only setting up a franchise but introducing you to all these characters, you know, making it move and feel breezy and like a superhero movie should, and not wear out its welcome and be like 3 hours but be like clear and concise within 2 hours. Like it had a lot to
Yeah,
do, and
that's probably my
there's
favorite part, by the way, is that this movie is an hour and 40 minutes long. It's really
yeah,
great.
yeah, the right on the money. And that's a tough juggling act to do. And while they don't always stick the landing, they do well enough that I, you know, was never really bored watching this movie. And I still found myself enjoying it. And that's coming from somebody who does not normally, you know, enjoy a lot of superhero movies. So the fact that even despite these things that I am nitpicking about, I still really enjoyed the movie. And a lot of that is due to, I think, is the balancing act between Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen. I think their Charles Xavier and Magneto's relationship against the two of each other, on like this eternal chessboard fighting for mutant rights, is such an interesting concept and executed very well in these movies.
Yeah, I mean, right. That's like the strength of all the X-Men movies, and probably just X-Men as a property, is it's like this really interesting question about what happens when the people you want to persecute are like also really powerful, you know, like
Yeah.
even though they're a minority, like, and so I don't know, like I definitely love that part of it. I think, what did you think of the action in this movie? Because I was watching it and I thought that that was a thing that I liked, and the more I've been thinking about it, it's just like amazing to think about how different it is than action now, you know, like how the effects work and how big set pieces are.
You can
So I don't know, like
feel
what are your thoughts on that? Did you think that was a plus or a minus?
you can feel how limited they are in this go around, by the times, by maybe, you know, like what they were able to pull off, like on how big you can go. But I think the action in this movie at some points is solid, but the action ending is atrocious. That scene,
Wait, which part specifically?
so the scene that I remember enjoying this scene as a kid and being like, that's so fucking dope. And then watching it now as an adult, I was like, that's so fucking stupid. Is when Sabretooth, that he's Wolverine and Sabretooth are fighting on top of the Statue of Liberty, and he throws Wolverine and he like claws the tip of the crown, and they do like the 360 camera track with him to then like he lets go of it and then just somehow just defies the laws of physics to just write himself on it. And I'm like, that's so stupid.
Yeah, it looked kind of weird, right?
Yeah,
Like
it looked wonky
I
as fuck.
I didn't know that it was I didn't know that I wouldn't call it stupid, but I know it definitely stood out to me where I was like, "Oh wow, how did he end up like that facing that way? That's not what it looked like."
I'm like watching it, and it reminded me of that scene in like Emperor's New Groove when like the bad guys show up before David Spade, and he's like, "How'd you guys get here before us?" And she's like, "Yeah, how did we get here before us?" And the guy's like, "I don't know. Looking at the map, it just doesn't make sense."
Yeah. No, so but yeah, I mean that part was definitely a little bit weird. I thought it was really noticeable like that Cyclops like eye blasts were definitely not up to snuff with today's effects. Like it wasn't like awful, and I remember at the time thinking that it was like really cool looking. But watching it now I'm kind of like, "Oh, that's like really hokey actually. It's like
Yeah,
very obviously fake."
that's one of the ones where at the time it was probably like really revolutionary and like crazy, and with everything we've seen since then, it's become very muted and
Yeah, like
feels like limited.
yeah, like his eyes, I would say Magneto's like electromagnetic radiation machine like that pulsed out and then
Oh yeah, that looked awful. When that
it
like
was dated. It was
beam,
dated
yeah,
for sure.
yeah, when that beam shoots out like to the people towards Ellis Island, like it you can it feels very mid 2000s.
Again, like I remember at the time thinking that that movie like looked really cool and it was probably cutting edge, right? But yeah, it's just very obvious now. So like that didn't hold up as well to me.
The action to
Um
me, well, I think the more scaled down action works better. So like when we first meet Wolverine up in Canada and he's fighting in the cage, and then Rogue hitches the ride with him and he gets thrown out of the car when like the tree collapses,
yeah,
like
100%,
that
yeah.
looked really good and that still held up. But whenever they had to go like big and grandiose and really take usage of the CGI of the era is where it started to like fall apart.
Yeah, so no, I agree. Like that those early sections were really awesome, and that's a big part of why I liked the first like half hour, 45 minutes, probably more than anything in this movie. Um and yeah, the special effects definitely got a little wonky at sometimes. And then kind of like maybe the tiebreaker here and the thing that I'm on the fence the most about in terms of like the action in this movie. Um is that whole last like act when they're going into Ellis Island as the X-Men in their jet. It's just so much less big. It's so much smaller, I guess is the easier way to say that. So much smaller than movies today in those ending set pieces that are usually so over the top. Like not even in superhero movies, like just in action movies in general, like Mission Impossible, even like Edge of Tomorrow, and I know I'm just naming Tom Cruise movies at this point, but but
There's a
but
reason he's the king.
yeah, but just like straight science fiction movies or just regular action movies, those third acts are so big these days. And like you could tell that this was the year 2000's version of big, but like it had a very like cheesy quality to it, which is like they get into the thing and everybody gets like one-on-one off like through these like really lame closing doors, and the fights are like really underwhelming, right? Like compared to, and like I don't even know, underwhelming might be too strong of a word because I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. It was just like, and I kind of liked the end of this movie, but it's just so like strikingly different than what you see in a big movie, like big ensemble blockbuster movie today.
Well, even just taking a look at it from, just like the X-Men comics to the movie, when you get those X-Men battles, it's big and huge because there's so many of them and it's like a huge like battleground almost. So it must have been like, I guess, a
Yeah,
disappointing thing to see when it's like, oh, here it comes. Like it's going to be like the Brotherhood facing off against the X-Men. We're going to get that big, huge, like 4v4. And then they all
yeah, and
just
it's
branch
just like
off.
so like lame combat, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Like
And it's very,
just get into this headspace for a second, right?
yeah.
You go to see a new X-Men movie in 2023, and like a big part of the last act of the movie is shot for shot that fight scene that Toad has.
Well, it would be, people would
It would be
be
so
losing their mind.
underwhelming,
Yeah.
right?
It would be
I
so
mean, like,
undercooked.
yeah, he literally just like closes a few things with his tongue. He like slaps somebody with his tongue. Um, and then he does like the weird like Toad jumps, which at that point I was like, all right, this power is like a little bit better than I was giving it credit for. And then he like kicks somebody down an elevator shaft and does like a weird like spin move with that with that staff.
I think
Um,
they're also limited by the fact that like they had to be kind of scaled back on the mutants they're picking. Because like just Toad in general is just like
yeah,
the
right,
worst.
right.
Like
Like
the only
it's
time he
like
did
it's like
anything cool was when he like I don't know if it was on Ellis Island or somewhere, but he just like dives off of somewhere and you hear him literally just stomp a human being like he lands on a dude's shoulders and just crushes him to death. And you're
yeah.
like, that's the first cool thing I've seen this guy do this entire, and it's the only cool thing I ever see this guy do the entire movie. Or no, he's actually, I take it back. He's not bad, but his problem is that the one good usage that he uses once and then never uses it again. When he spits that like green slime at Jean Grey to the point that she can't breathe, it's like, why didn't you just do that to every single X-Men and you guys won?
Yeah, yeah, that does seem pretty powerful.
Like you use that move once, that girl was choking to death. If it wasn't for Cyclops, like she was dead.
Yeah. No, so like I don't know. I definitely see your point. Toad, like in the script, might as well have been named the guy who saves us money on special effects, right? Like that's
Yeah,
like because his powers are like so like not special effect driven.
but Sabretooth also, he's just strong. Like
Yeah, I
it's
mean
not like
that's another fair point, right? Like he just like puts some makeup on him and like maybe a wig, and then he's
yes.
Sabretooth.
Well, you could tell like they definitely spent a lot of the money on Mystique, and and good that
That
they
looked
did
very
because
cool.
yeah, she looked great throughout the entire movie. Everything she does is fantastic,
Yeah,
and you
thank
could
you for
tell.
mentioning that because that
Yeah,
was like the stuff that still does hold up in my opinion. Like when she
yeah,
morphs from like Iceman into back into Mystique when she's at the
yeah.
school.
That special effect whenever she morphs always looks good. So
Yeah.
you could tell they put a lot into that one, and it's entirely possible that a large majority of the budget, because it was only 75 million the budget, so like that's not that big when you look at like today.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty substantial budget for a movie back then, I think. But it definitely shows in that part, yeah. And I mean, even in the Cyclops parts, like at the time, like we said, that was probably pretty cutting edge. So I think like as somebody who watched this movie when it came out, I'd say they got their money's worth. You know, as somebody watching it 25 years later, I'm kind of like, it looked kind of weird, but I think they did a great job with a lot of it. And Mystique honestly is like such a convenient character to pick too, because her power is like so lame in terms of like plot. You know what I mean?
And
Like,
she's basically a walking Deus Ex Machina for the bad guys. Like whenever we
yeah,
need something to move the plot forward, we can just have her pretend to be Iceman and like tell Rogue that Charles Xavier is really mad at you and you better get out of here.
yeah. It's like she's like a walking like Mission Impossible mask. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like that's like which again, there's been two Mission Impossible movies at this point that make great use of those masks, and that's just kind of like it feels like that's the whole reason she's in the movie, outside of the fact that Rebecca Romaine is really hot. Um, like that's like the whole reason she's in it because it's like, oh, we can keep doing these like weird body switch moves, like these
yeah.
body switch scenes.
And it definitely feels that like a lot of it was what can we save money on and what is super convenient. Because even like Magneto, like he moves the metal and everything, but it's like with Ian McKellen, it's not like he's doing a lot of heavy lifting there either. It definitely feels like they got as many starter mutants as they possibly could to save money on the budget. But
Yeah, yeah,
the ones where they do use it do look really well. Like we said, Mystique looks great. That scene when the drunk dude is trying to get his money back from Wolverine, and Wolverine like pulls the two claws out and then slowly pulls the middle one out.
yeah,
Like that still looks fantastic.
yeah. It looked
And that
amazing.
yeah, that looked freaking great. So the ones that they do use the money on still do look good. And Storm's effect still holds up pretty well, like whenever they make usage of like any type of like weather
Yeah,
event, which is that one still
yeah,
cracks
like
me
when
up.
she does that really horrible one-liner before she zaps the toad guy in the tongue with the lightning.
Yeah, that's another thing that there's no quotable dialogue really in this movie that I would go back to, really. And some of the ones that you can tell that they maybe wanted to do not land.
Yeah, I mean, like there's not like a one-liner that stands out to me in a positive way, and you know it like those action one-liners that were like probably in their peak at the time that this movie came out.
Yeah, so
Um,
like
yeah,
I
like
don't
there's
know
not ones that
who.
stand out in a good way. That
Yeah,
Toad
like
one, I've heard that the Toad one made more sense in an earlier cut of the movie, because like the way they filmed it, apparently the Toad was supposed to have a lot more lines and would always be saying things like, "Oh, you know what a toad does like this," you know what I mean, or like what happens when a toad does this. Like he was supposed to
gotcha.
say
So like
that a bunch throughout the movie. So like there was supposed to be some kind of context for that line, but like I don't even know that the context helps, you know? Like
yeah, once you got rid of all of his, like hers should have went too. But then at that point, you're recontextualizing the entire way that she gets rid of him at the end. But yeah, I don't know who on the day was like how Holly Berry was like, yeah, sure, I'll say that line. Do you know what
I
happens
mean,
to a toad when it gets struck by
what
lightning?
what's she gonna do? Not say it? I guess I
No,
don't
I
know.
know, but like I would just be like, bro, like really, this line, really?
Yeah,
The
and I
same
mean that's
thing
like
that
one of
happens to everything else.
she's another one that doesn't really have a lot of lines in that movie.
Dude, so Heather watched a small portion of this movie with me. By the end, she kind of tuned out. But I think like the first 2/3 of the movie, like she even turned to me and was like, "Has Halle Berry said a word yet?" And I was like, "I think she said like one sentence."
Right. She's definitely like yeah, so I don't know. It's just very interesting the way that like I do like this movie, but they've somehow managed to make like nobody like really stand out in a big way. I don't know. It's a very interesting way they did it with this ensemble. And like I think a big part of it is it's freaking me out like who's famous now compared to who was famous then and like how some of these like much bigger actors now are like basically invisible in this movie. It's just like very interesting the way that it worked out.
It's crazy. They got a lot of people before they really became big. Like Hugh Jackman is everywhere now. Holly Berry was what? She was still 2 years out from winning an Academy Award when she was in X-Men.
Ye- I don't think wait, the way you worded that was funny. It made it sound like she
Sorry.
won an Academy Award for X-Men.
For X-Men. Yeah,
I
dude.
think
In her
I want to
stellar
say
turn in
Monsters Ball
X2,
was like 2004, which I think that's what she won the
somewhere.
Oscar for, right?
Yeah, that was yeah. So that was somewhere in the mid 2000s. So yeah, you had a lot of like up and coming people here that were like James Marsden as Cyclops. Like you had so many
Oh
people
yeah,
that
yeah.
were, yeah, that have really gone on to become huge actors. And then you have, Magneto's side where like I don't think anyone's ever heard from Sabretooth ever again.
Yeah,
And
dude, did you know who Sabretooth was?
I know he's a wrestler, right?
Yeah, so
I
I
I
watched
don't know which wrestler, but I remember that he was a wrestler, but I don't remember who.
yeah, I couldn't even tell you his name honestly, but I watched this on Amazon and so like I would always like I was like mousing every once in a while to see like the little trivia pop-ups that
Oh,
Amazon
that pops
has.
up.
So you'll appreciate this. The original person who was supposed to play Sabretooth in this movie, I'll give you like I don't know, one guess. Think
Uh,
wrestling.
in wrestling, it was supposed to be a
Yeah, it was
different
a
wrestler.
wrestler, yeah.
It's supposed to be a different wrestler.
Different wrestler, yeah.
I mean, the one that stands out to me that probably would have fit perfect there is Triple H.
Nope.
It
No, not
wasn't
Triple
Triple
H.
H.
It was Kevin
Mr.
Nash.
Kevin.
Yeah, and it was like from what I read on this blurb on Amazon, it was a done deal. Like he had the part, and there was like I guess a scheduling conflict or something that came up, so he didn't end up doing the movie. But the
My
guy
God.
who did was like one of his like tag partners at some point.
That's hilarious. I like how they were like, we can't get this wrestler. We should get another wrestler.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah,
That's
because that was a
so
big thing
funny.
back then too, was like putting wrestlers in your action movies as
Yeah.
like these goonish villains.
Yeah, it
Like
was
remember Triple
shoehorning them
H was
in.
in Blade? I think Blade 2.
Yeah, no, it was Trinity, right? It was the third one.
Yeah, maybe. I don't remember. It
The
was
one,
either
the one
2
with
or
Ryan
3. I don't
Reynolds.
remember.
I think that was the
But
third.
he was in one of them like The Rock was in like the Scorpion King of like version of the Mummy. It was like a thing
Yeah,
that happened a lot back then.
you put them in
And I mean,
every.
I guess technically it still happens now.
Yeah, but now like you get actual juggernaut wrestlers that are, cool actors these days.
Hey, Juggernaut's not in this movie. He's not in it until the next one.
God.
But yeah, and then the other the other one that I thought was interesting about this was like I'd forgot that anybody had ever played Sabretooth besides Liev Schreiber. So I was like, wait a minute, like Liev Schreiber wasn't Sabretooth.
You
Like I
know,
like
he
literally I like paused the movie and went back. I was like, no, wait a second, it's him, right? He plays him in X2 then? Like when does he play Sabretooth? I thought he was the only one. And then it
unfortunately
turns out
only showed up
he didn't play him until like X like Wolverine
Origins.
Origins or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, he unfortunately did not get to play him until the absolute travesty that was X-Men Origins
Yeah, what
Wolverine.
a dropped ball though. He was so much better as Sabretooth than the clowns they had in this movie.
Well, I guess like I wonder if they at that point had shot their load in regards to like getting somewhat decent actors, and they were just like, we need someone we can get for really cheap that just looks
Right.
menacing, and they were like,
Right. We
just get a
need somebody
wrestler.
who's going to work at like close to scale and they're not going
Yeah,
to say anything.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Because also like, I don't does Sabretooth say a word other than just like growling in this movie?
I think he has a couple of lines. Yeah. Like
Yeah.
they were very like forgettable though.
So like you're just like, we don't need to pay somebody big for that. Just get a wrestler, throw him in there, just have him growl a bunch. Just got
Yeah.
really filed down teeth. Because then they did the
Yeah.
same thing with Toad, where they got Ray Park, which granted Ray Park is, for what he's done in the role. He was like the pre Andy Circus, just not as, good of like an actual actor, but he was, because
Oh,
he was
okay.
Darth
He was
Maul.
doing like a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because he was Darth Maul, and then they had him as Toad. But he's probably another one that they were just like, he probably worked for scale and like we save a lot of money on this guy.
Yeah, right, right. And he can do those cool jumps and then like he can spin the staff at the end.
Exactly, exactly. Spins
Which
the
wow,
staff.
now that I realize it's the guy who played Darth Maul, it's like wow, of course they asked him to spin that staff around for no
Yeah.
reason.
They're like, do some cool spin moves, bro. It's gonna look great.
Yeah. Just like you're not just Toad, you're like a karate expert. Go for it.
Yeah. But there are so many things in this movie that feel so, like late 90s, early 2000s that had me grinning from ear to ear and just remembering like those times when like movies, even though they were serious at times, could still be like really like over the top silly. Like the scene when Wolverine steals Cyclops's motorcycle and he's like driving in the night and then he hits like the boost and it starts going so fast. You just see him like doing that like weird smile while like the wind is hitting him. And you're just like, dude, this is the silliest shit ever. And it has the really sped up like motion capture camera while it's going through the like winding roads.
Yeah, yeah,
Dude, this
yeah.
is so early 2000s. It hurts.
Yeah, yeah, 100%, yeah. And like, I don't know, I think a lot of the stuff we were saying about the effects in this movie can apply to like basically any movie from this time period, you know?
Oh
Like
yeah, like
where
I'm sure
there's like
X-Men's not the only,
yeah, like a lot of it hits, a lot of it misses, a lot of it you look back on and you're like, "Oh wow, that still actually looks pretty good." And a lot of it you're just like, "Oh my God, who put this in this movie?" So
yeah,
yeah, like it's definitely like it's weird that you can almost identify it by that trait that it's from this time period, you know?
it almost is like a trope in and of itself that like early 2000s movie.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. It's like
Like
the
you
movies like this are like a time capsule for me because they're
yeah,
it's just so funny to think that there was a time where this was like the biggest, most over the top movie anybody was making.
it's funny to see like the juxtaposition of it where like it feels so scaled back compared to what we see today, but at the same time like it was the biggest thing of its era but feels so of its era.
Yeah, yeah,
It's just such
100%.
a funny comparison to look at when you look at these movies, but definitely one of the better superhero movies that I've watched. Like it didn't hurt me to go back and rewatch this like it has some other superhero movies that I've seen in my time and
Oh
ones that
yeah,
we're
give me
going
some names. Throw some names at me.
well, the ones that we're gonna get to later on down the line. Like think of any superhero movie that we saw in high school that wasn't Batman or Spider-Man.
Oh yeah, because we're getting into like
Anything,
Daredevil and
yeah,
Elektra
yeah,
and
yeah, exact Fantastic Four.
right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So like
Oh wow. Yeah, wow. Remember how bad that was for so long?
Yeah.
We just we just named like probably like 5 of like the top 20 worst movies I've ever seen.
And those were the superhero movies that we got to grow up with, folks. Like outside of the Chris Nolan Batman and the Sam Raimi Spider-Man and these X-Men movies, like that's what we had.
Yeah, or like the Eric Bana Hulk.
Yeah.
That's like not too long after this. That's like 2003, 2004, right? Something
Yep.
like that.
Ghost Rider.
Oh, Ghost Rider was really good though. Come on.
All right.
It wasn't until Spirit of Vengeance that things really went south for Ghost Rider.
That'll be a fun one to return to because I don't think I've watched Ghost Rider since we've seen it in theaters. Same for most
Yeah.
of these. Like I don't think because I'm pretty sure we hated Electro when we saw it back then too. So there's no way I've ever returned to Electro.
Yeah, Electro was awful. So
So yeah. So
that's gonna
getting
be an
in.
interesting one to do on this podcast.
Yeah. So like those
Because I
those were
know I saw
our
that in theaters with you for sure. I know
yeah.
that.
Yeah, those were the superhero movies that we got to grow up with. Like there, we didn't get no MCU, no DCEU, none of the shit you guys got today. Those are our superheroes. Do you have anything else? Anything else that drops out of note for X-Men?
No, I mean, other than I guess like my final thought would be that this is the second week in a row where all like I was thinking while watching this movie was like, man, the second one is so much better. Like,
Yeah, I had that same thought too because I remember that the X2 is like the peak of the X-Men franchise.
yeah, like last week I was saying with Scary Movie, the whole time I was just mad it wasn't Scary Movie 3. That's kind of how I felt about watching this movie. It was just like it just made me remember more things about X2 and I was like, man, I could just be watching X2 right now. That movie is so
Yes.
much better than this. Um so yeah, like that's kind of like my final thought. Like it's probably going to get a low score because I just know like that they really deliver on this premise
The later
next
ones.
time.
Yeah, well, I guess that's something that can go against it and in its favor because at the same time, while you're sitting there and being like, oh, like the next one is really where it hits, I wonder how well that would hit if that was just a standalone movie and we didn't get like the full setup from this movie to lead into that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like I haven't seen X2 in a while, but I have a feeling that it stands alone pretty well, is my guess.
I don't know.
So
Yeah, I haven't watched that one in a while too, so it will be interesting to see if that one holds up better as a standalone movie and manages to juggle everything that we've kind of discussed in this one.
yeah, because I mean, not to get too ahead of ourselves here, but that's kind of like what they set up when they're in the middle of that chess match at the end. Is that they're like, well, what happens when aren't you afraid that these people are gonna come and find you and grab you? And he's like, yeah, and it's like that's literally what the second movie's about. Like that's what the whole movie is about. Is that people come after Charles Xavier and his school. So
Yes.
in that sense, like I think it's very standalone because like if you just started that movie and like I am aware of what X-Men is and you're like, hey, this is Charles Xavier, this is his school. I'm like, all right, cool. I know everything I need to know about what this movie's about.
I think I would echo mostly everything that you said. It is one of those movies that you watch and I did enjoy it. I didn't hate it. But it is one of those ones where you're watching it and you're just thinking about like the ones that they've done better. And I don't want to like let that affect my score for this one, but it definitely is something that sits there in the back of your head while you're watching this one
Oh,
that
it's
you're just
definitely
like
affecting my score.
fair. That is fair. But yeah, I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's a superhero movie, so I try not to go too deep into my like criticizing of it because at the end of the day, it's just supposed to be like dumb fun anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But all right, Jim, let's hear it. Final rating for X-Men.
All right, so I'm torn.
Here we go. This is always the hardest time for you as we get to it because I know you're just thinking about the list in the back of your mind while you're crafting your
It's all
score.
I'm thinking about. It's all I'm thinking about because because I'm sitting here and I'm saying I'm waffling between two scores, right? And I'm saying to myself that this one potentially makes this way too high on the list, and this one potentially makes it way too low on the list. Um, again because Rugrats is way too high. like, like, so I am going to see how this plays out, and
All
I'm gonna
right.
go with my gut here and give this movie a 2.5.
Ooh, a 2.5 from
Yeah, dead in the middle.
Jimbo.
It was enjoyable, but at the same time it was disappointing and like kind of underwhelming, if only because I know that they make the better X-Men movie like a couple years later.
I'm actually surprised by that score because I thought you would honestly give it a better score than I would. But we're actually in the inverse here because I am
See
actually going
now.
to give it 3 stars.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah. No, yeah, I'm at, I would to me this is right like you're saying, like middle of the line. This is right middle of the pack for me. It has plenty of stuff in it that I enjoyed, plenty of stuff in it that I criticized, but at the end of the day, it was just a solid, enjoyable movie.
Yeah,
And
and like this isn't a dig on it in any way, but the runtime definitely helps. Like the fact that it's shorter, like keeps me engaged and
absolutely.
keeps it like I'm not saying like oh it was good because it ended earlier. Like I just mean like like the pacing was much better because this wasn't like a 2 3 hour epic. So that's like yeah, it's enjoyable. It's like you get in, you get out, and other than that, it's nothing really. No great shakes.
Absolutely. So, with your 2.5 and my 3, that brings us to an overall score of 5.5, which puts
Which
this movie what do you I can see you itching to say something. What do you
I
got?
think that's kind of right where I hoped it would be. I
Also,
think
this
because like when I gave it a 2.5, my worry was that you would also give it like a 2 and then it would be like right near Rugrats when it's far superior to Rugrats. I want to make that clear. So I think I'm pretty happy with where it ended up. I'm pretty happy with 5.5.
that's right. Yeah, I think and 5.5 is, that's right in the middle of the pack. Like we said, like this I think the score definitely reflects our feelings on this movie. And even right here, as you look on the list, it's sandwiched right in between. It sits below 4 of the best movies and then above 4 of the lower movies that we've done. So
Oh
this
wow, so it's
movie,
literally
yeah,
right dead center
yeah,
right now.
literally dead of the pack. It sits right now.
What's the closest thing below it and the closest thing above it?
So it's right behind Star Wars Episode 1, which sits with
Okay.
6, and then it's just ahead of Pokemon the movie, which sits at 5. Well, technically Pokemon and Scary Movie are tied at 5.
Right,
So it
okay.
sits right above those two. So
Yeah,
that's
that I mean that sounds about right, honestly. It's better
right.
than those other movies, like in my opinion, and it's probably a little bit worse than Phantom Menace, but both of those movies are like kind of mediocre. Yeah.
So I would say I'm also pretty happy with where that movie ended up landing here on the list. So
Right. The
we
list lives
pass.
to fight another
Yeah,
week.
we pass another week where Jim can rest easy knowing that the list hasn't become a complete travesty to him
It
yet.
still has some integrity.
But we still are early on, and don't worry, we will have plenty of opportunities to absolutely destroy this list for you.
Yeah, well, we'll see when it happens, and I'll believe me, I'll let you know when it happens.
Oh,
But
I
so far,
know.
so good.
No, you will. Well, maybe as we turn our attention to next week, will next week's movie potentially be able to finally break the camel's back for you here, Jim? I'm going to give you, as always, we'll do our solid little guessing game for you. So, next
Yeah.
week's movie is actually a Christmas movie.
Okay.
So we went
Um,
from three straight weeks of Rob taking me to the movies in July, and then never went again until the holidays. So we've got a 2000s Christmas movie
Yeah, which by
starring.
the way, that's pretty normal movie going habits. You go to a bunch of movies in the summer and then you like probably see one movie around Christmas.
That's fair. As when you're a
So
kid.
wait, so when you say it's a Christmas movie, do you mean it came out around Christmas or like it's about Christmas or both, I suppose? I mean, if it's about Christmas, it probably came out around Christmas.
Yeah, both. It came out around the holidays. I think it came out like right around Thanksgiving. And it was meant for the holidays. It is a Christmas movie. It stars probably the biggest comedian of that time.
Of that time, like comedian in terms of movies?
Yeah, movies, not like stand-up comedian or anything, but like the biggest comedy actor at that time.
Huh. All right, so 90s two comedy actors jump out to me right away.
Okay.
And that's Adam Sandler and Jim Carrey.
It's one of those guys.
Um, Eight Crazy Nights is an Adam Sandler movie, but you said it's about Christmas, and that movie's about Hanukkah, and I think it's like a little bit older, or sorry, a little bit newer than 2000.
I think Eight Crazy Nights, we were possibly in high school by then. I know it was later into the 2000s.
Yeah. So yeah, Christmas, Jim Carrey, early 2000s. It's got to be The Grinch, right? That's like the only thing that makes any sense.
Oh, it is the Grinch, all right.
Yes.
We will be
I'm
diving
actually pretty good at
into.
this game.
Yeah, it's not too bad. Well, I mean, it definitely. I feel
The
like
hints
once,
help.
yeah, the hints out. I feel like once I went biggest comedy actor of the era, it kind of helps lighten that load because how many comedy actors at that point had a Christmas movie?
Yeah, I don't know. There's probably people I'm not thinking of, but those were just like
Probably,
the
but
first two that come to mind.
that is the biggest one. But yes, we will be diving into Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, an
Wow.
absolutely quintessential Christmas movie, if I do say so myself.
Yeah, this is one that I definitely have some mixed feelings about. It'll be interesting to go back and watch again.
It'll be a fun one to dive. Have you watched that movie? Is that on your Christmas playlist? Do you do Christmas movies around the holidays? Do you dive into Christmas movies or is that not your style?
Yeah, no, I definitely do. Like me and my dad and my brother watch Die Hard usually.
Well, hey, Piers, there might be some people here that would heavily
Oh
contest.
God, I don't want to talk about it. It's such a stupid debate. Like, it's obviously a Christmas movie. It starts with like Christmas tunes and like
Yeah.
everybody's in like Santa hats. He's at a
I mean, if
Christmas
if
party.
there's a fucking Christmas tree in it, like,
Yeah, and not to mention, it's all about him like reconnecting with his family. Like, come on.
so doesn't it take place on Christmas Day or like Christmas Eve?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you
So it's
tell me
like,
the difference between the arc that Bruce Willis has in Die Hard and the arc that Arnold Schwarzenegger has in Jingle All the Way. Just so you tell me the difference. They're just like dads that need to learn to stop working so hard and put their family first, you know? Um
dude, that is so spot on. It's amazing. Just two
yeah, so
juggernauts
like
right
we do
there.
Die Hard. Me and my dad usually watch Reindeer Games. I don't know if you remember that movie.
That is one. No, I do remember that movie because you were the one who told me to watch that movie, and I had never been happier with the decision of my life because that is
Yeah.
such good schlock. Like that is fantastic.
Honestly, I'm gonna have to look up when that movie came out because that might be another good pick for a couple episodes here. In a couple episodes here.
Oh, definitely. I think that was late '90s, so it should be right around in that time frame.
Yeah, I'll have to double check.
Definitely,
But like we watch those
definitely
movies,
would.
and then yeah, I watch like other random Christmas fare. But this is not one of them. This isn't one that I
Not
go out
one
of my
of
way
them.
to watch every
Oh
year.
man, yeah. So this will be a fun one to dive into though to see then the difference in opinion. I think this might be a good one where we might be on opposite ends here finally.
Yeah, I mean, like I don't know. I wouldn't say right now that I overtly dislike it. It is just kind of like forgettable. So like I'm interested to see what I think about it when I go back and watch
You're
it
like
this time around.
revisiting now. See, but that's what I mean. Like you're coming there from a perspective that it's not a movie that's really on your repertoire a lot. Like you're coming back to this for the first time and God knows how long. And I'm
Yeah.
one of those ones who obviously watched it
You
as a
watch
kid.
this every year?
Not every year. But I do I've watched it more often than a lot of other movies around the holidays. If that makes
Gotcha.
any sense. Yeah, it's definitely one of those ones that like if I'm in the mood for for a Christmas movie, like that one's always in rotation.
Sounds good. Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to it, man.
Yeah, so that's gonna be a good one. But that will be for next week. This is the end for us. Jim, do you have anything to leave the people with this week?
You know what happens when this podcast ends? The
What?
same thing that happens when every other podcast ends.
Now, see that joke worked really well earlier because we said like what Toad does throughout the entire podcast, but then we had to cut all those lines.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
but
Let's say that it worked. Let's stop.
yeah,
You could have stopped there. I'll take it.
there we go. But that will do it for all of us here in this episode of Front Row Cinema. As always, until next time, we'll see you at the movies.